Wartime supply chain disruptions continue. What is port-proximate and why is it changing? And work remains to optimize pharmaceutical supply chains. Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. Hi, I'm Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by Storage Solutions. As the official North American arm of Jungheinrich, Storage Solutions brings more than 70 years of material handling and automation experience to operations across the U.S. and Canada. As you continue to plan for 2026, they can help you explore smarter automation, improve productivity, and build a strategy for long-term success. Learn more at storage-solutions.com. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, as the war against Iran continues, supply chains continue to feel the effects, whether that is oil tankers stuck in the Strait of Hormuz, or disruptions to air cargo flying through the Middle East, or the many other impacts that conflicts of this type bring. To find out the latest, Victoria Kickham is here with this week's guest. Victoria?
Thank you, Dave. Our guest today is Ian Massey, Head of Corporate Intelligence for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at global intelligence and cybersecurity firm S-RM. And as you say, he's here to give us an update on the effects of the war in the Middle East on commerce and supply chains. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much, Victoria. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. I'll just jump right in. And given the escalation of the war in Iran, what do you see as the greatest threats or challenges to corporations and supply chains at the moment? And I know this is a very fluid situation, but as we see it now.
Thank you. Look, I think one of the biggest challenges for corporations, particularly multinational ones, is actually how to deal with that fluidity and the uncertainty that comes from it. Today in many sectors, maybe even most, modern supply chains are highly sophisticated and very complex. Many have been designed for maximum efficiency, both in terms of cost and timing, and a lot run on just-in-time basis to keep inventory costs low. So in this context, where you have significant uncertainty in whatever form it takes, it can be very challenging to plan for and highly disruptive. So the trajectory in the war in Iran, with it being highly uncertain, it's making it very difficult for corporations to assess the duration and the scale of the disruption to their supply chains. Beyond that, many multinationals have staff and physical assets in the Gulf region. Clearly, their top concern centers on the duty of care for staff in the face of an elevated security threat. And we've been working with many clients to help them assess the situation on the ground, to validate intelligence and to identify misinformation, and to help them improve their resilience and, where necessary, evacuate their staff.
That's a lot to deal with for sure. What particular industries are most in jeopardy under the current scenario in your view? I mean, obviously energy markets, shipping and logistics, travel, they're feeling the brunt, but I'm wondering if there are any other industries that may be particularly susceptible, to the problems that we're seeing and that you just articulated.
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious and the highest profile is clearly the energy sector. A fifth of global oil exports and a significant proportion of LNG trade normally pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar is a top 3 global LNG exporter, for example, and its gas has been vital in offsetting the import of Russian gas, sort of curtailing after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, particularly in Europe. You're closely linked to that. Clearly, with the seaborne trade, you've got the impact on shipping. But if we look at some of the slightly less obvious sectors, you've already mentioned infrastructure, which has been directly targeted by Iran in its response to the conflict. Iran clearly cannot match the military capabilities of the US and the Israeli military, so its response strategy has been asymmetric, principally designed to maximize the economic impact of the conflict in order to generate diplomatic and political pressure. This strategy has seen it target infrastructure assets in at least 3 very important subsectors. So transport and logistics, thinking ports and airports, energy infrastructure, and perhaps again slightly less obvious, but digital infrastructure. We've seen direct strikes targeting data centers, for example. So that is another key sector. And then beyond that, I would also draw out a few less obvious but no less significant second order effects on other sectors. The oil and gas supply crunch will impact industries that rely on hydrocarbon-based raw materials during their production processes. So petrochemicals, plastics, fertilizer, manufacturing will all be impacted, and some sectors that sit downstream of those. So, for example, agriculture and food production.
So I know much of your work focuses on scenario planning. I wonder, how should companies prepare to deal with the situation as it changes here? I don't know if you can kind of encapsulate a few scenarios that they should plan for.
The short answer is it's very challenging. Yeah. But I think in terms of the scenarios that they should plan for, broadly speaking, when we've been sort of discussing with clients and acting as a sounding board for some of their challenges and ideas, we've been considering three key scenarios. So the first being significant escalation in the conflict. This would see the US and Israel continue high intensity military operations, potentially with increased focus on strategically important assets or targets such as Harg Island, the Abu Musa and Tums Islands in the Strait of Hormuz, or maybe even Iran's uranium stockpiles. That scenario is obviously likely to involve a continued aggressive response from Iran. The second scenario we've been considering is a more protracted conflict that is effectively contained regional instability. It would take the form of maybe lower intensity military strikes and a conflict characterized by intermittent airstrikes, missile exchanges, and cyber operations, with Iran, with the regime continuing to remain intact and continuing to lash out sporadically at the Gulf states and the perceived US partners in the region and their associated commercial infrastructure. And then the last scenario that we've been considering and discussing with clients is some form of conflict de-escalation. This scenario would materialize either from a breakthrough in talks between Iran and the US, which are reported to be being facilitated by Pakistan, or from the US announcing it's met its objectives and effectively ceasing direct involvement in the military campaign. So those are the three key scenarios, all of which have a slightly different shape to them and could have very different impacts on commercial operations, both in terms of duration and severity.
So along with that, and I think you mentioned it earlier, companies are feeling the effects of all of this in elevated costs. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, where you're seeing the greatest pain, and how do you see that playing out over the long term, given the different scenarios you just mentioned?
I think in the short term, the impact is clearly going to be felt on those sectors that are directly impacted by the conflict. So energy, which we've already discussed, infrastructure, which is being actively targeted, shipping and logistics. You've had both ports and air hubs have been targeted by the Iranian regime, and a lot of vessels are effectively stuck inside the Gulf on the wrong side of the Strait of Hormuz. And then lastly, I would say travel and tourism, which is a vital sector for many Gulf states. So those are the most obvious, where I think there's going to be that direct short-term impact. In the medium to long term, I think the consequences will be much more widely felt. Economists are already talking about a severe shock to energy markets, perhaps the most severe since the 1970s. And we're likely to see rising input costs across many sectors that directly or indirectly rely on those hydrocarbon-based raw materials.
Well, given all this, and you mentioned your work with different clients and the scenarios you're talking with them about, aside from that, is there any general advice you'd give to businesses as they try to manage their supply chains now and in the coming weeks?
In situations that are as dynamic as this, it's impossible to predict outcomes or to plan for every eventuality. Forecasting can be a very fruitless game. Um, However, I would say to companies that are facing these challenges, it does not negate the importance of intelligence collection and analysis, and then detailed scenario planning. So for me, leadership teams at organizations that are directly or indirectly affected by the conflict should be, number one, closely monitoring the situation with targeted intelligence collection processes that are specifically mapped onto their own assets or interests in the region. They should also, secondly, be constructing key potential scenarios or development pathways that may impact their operations. For that latter point, it's not going to provide them with a perfect playbook. Should one of those scenarios materialize, and inevitably, events would unfold slightly differently. But what that type of scenario planning activity does is it enables organizations to develop different potential courses of action, which, when things happen quickly, having invested that time in preparation and having a few courses of action pre-prepared, gives organizations the baseline to act quickly and to pick courses of action and flex them without having to go through full planning processes. And I've seen this work as a former British Army officer. In the context of high intensity operations, you cannot plan for every eventuality, but having a detailed planning process through which you develop potential courses of action gives you the operational flexibility and basically a series of principles to help guide decision making under pressure.
Sound advice. Ian, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
My pleasure, Victoria. Thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable speaking to you.
Yeah, thank you. We have been talking with Ian Massey of S-RM. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Ian and Victoria. Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. And we've always seen that many companies build their warehouses near our nation's ports as a convenient location to receive their imported shipments. But Ben, you wrote this week that this may not be the current strategy.
Yeah, it's right. And of course, as you said, for years, importers have rented warehouse space right near the ports for the reasons that you cited. That's where the ships come. That's where the freight is. But that conventional wisdom seems to be shifting now. The industrial real estate firm Cushman Wakefield said that for the year of 2025, this past year, what they call port-proximate industrial markets, those that are right near the port, captured their lowest market share for 15 years. So that caught my eye. Instead of leasing warehouses right by the maritime ports, Cushman said that companies leasing industrial real estate for logistics are increasingly moving, especially large-scale distribution activity, away from coastal port markets and toward lower-cost inland logistics hubs. The numbers show that, again, those port-proximate industrial markets captured just 19% of the total U.S. industrial net absorption, which is a term for how many properties are actually rented, which, again, that was a 15-year low. But meanwhile, demand across the broader U.S. industrial market actually strengthened. So the issue wasn't that the entire market shrank. National net absorption rate across the country rose 16%. It's also not because overall imports have dropped, at least not by that much. To be sure, tariff volatility and geopolitical uncertainty, including the violence that Victoria was just talking about with our guest, have hurt container volume coming into the U.S., but those cargo volumes measured at the 10 largest U.S. maritime ports declined just 0.3% in 2025. So again, the overall market is holding fairly steady.
That's interesting, Ben. And you mentioned, of course, cost being another area a factor. Did they give any other reasons for the drop in demand for renting the warehouses near ports?
Yeah, I mean, the big picture reasons that Cushman and Wakefield gave, that they mentioned tariffs, nearshoring, and evolving supply chain strategies. That's a pretty big umbrella reason there. But perhaps, as you just mentioned, the simplest reason is the clearest one is the wallet there. It just costs too much. Industrial rents in port markets last year climbed 65%. That was between 2019 and 2023. And they remain 33% higher than the national average. So many occupiers, renters that is, particularly those requiring the bigger facilities, larger than 500,000 square feet, went looking for more cost-effective inland places. As a result, those port markets recorded only a 2% growth of industrial demand in 2025, compared with 21% growth on the inland markets. In the words of Jason Price, one of the report's authors from Cushman and Wakefield, he said port proximity remains important for speed to market and cross-docking functions, but large-scale distribution activity is increasingly shifting inland, where occupiers can access lower costs, more land, and modern facilities. And he said that port markets remain strategically important, but investors and occupiers are becoming far more selective. Building quality, infrastructure access, and proximity to population centers increasingly matters more than simply being located near a port.
Well, that makes sense. And of course, with everything supply chain, often cost savings and the ability to find labor override the location in selecting a property.
For sure. It's a complicated mix of variables.
Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
And Victoria, we keep hearing about many industries adopting new artificial intelligence tools. And you wrote in particular this week about how pharmaceutical supply chains are applying AI.
That's right. Yeah. So pharmaceutical companies are really racing to deploy artificial intelligence across their supply chains. But it seems the technology is not yet making a widespread impact. And this is according to industry research released this week from WBR Insights. And that research is titled Logipharma Playbook 2026 Supply Chain and Logistics Insights. And it was released as part of the upcoming Logipharma conference, which will be held in Europe next month. The conference is a global supply chain meeting that brings together senior leaders from pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical technology companies from around the world. And that's, I think, in mid-April. The researchers surveyed 100 heads of supply chain from across Europe to identify key challenges and emerging solutions facing the industry. And they found that pharmaceutical supply chains are, and I'm quoting, performing but not yet optimized. And they also found that there's work to be done when it comes to making the most of those AI investments.
So, Victoria, the use of AI in pharma supply chains is still evolving, but it seems to be in the early stages. Is that right?
Yeah, something like that. So the research shows that the pharma industry has progressed from AI ambition to practical deployment, and that's for things like data capture and decision making. On the other hand, strategic adoption of the technology remains limited. And I'll just give you a couple of statistics. 36% of the respondents said they're using AI in isolation or in experimental cases. And another 40% said they're actively planning or exploring AI as part of their supply chain roadmap. Essentially, the research found that respondents are finding early success with AI, but that the next stage will require transforming those results into projects that have more of an enterprise-wide impact. And just to give you a few other findings from the survey that kind of give us the landscape of how AI is playing out in this particular supply chain. 65% of supply chain leaders say they have limited confidence in AI's ability to predict or mitigate disruption. AI adoption is highest in 3 areas: demand planning, inventory optimization, and logistics orchestration. And another interesting statistic I found was that the most digitally connected supply chains are achieving, again, 3 things: 15% lower logistics costs, 35% lower inventory, and 65% higher service levels. So an interesting mix of opinions there, and it just seems to indicate to me that AI isn't solving all of our problems just yet, but maybe making some headway.
Yeah, it does seem that way. And that number of 65% lacking confidence in the predictability aspects of AI is rather striking, especially because that's one of the big advantages that are touted for AI. And I think that's especially critical with supply chains like pharmaceuticals to not have that kind of confidence in it. Seems like we've got a long way to go yet in implementing these new tools.
It does, yeah. So we'll certainly keep an eye on it.
As with any new technology, it takes some time to figure it all out.
It certainly does.
Thank you, Victoria.
You're welcome.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And again, we'd like to thank our guest, Ian Massey of S-RM. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. And a reminder that Logistics Matters is sponsored by Storage Solutions. As the official North American arm of Jungheinrich, Storage Solutions offers more than 70 years of material handling and automation experience to operations across the U.S. and Canada. As you continue to plan for 2026, they can help you explore smarter automation, improve productivity, and build a strategy for long-term success. Learn more at storage-solutions.com. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great week.